My brother's phone rang 9 minutes after I handed the signed documents to the notary. I know it was 9 minutes because I was watching the clock above the reception desk. Not out of nervousness, but the way you watch a timer you've already set. I was standing near the window on the far side of the lobby, my coat folded over my arm, my bag closed. My brother Derek was across the room with his wife Pamela, and they were the kind of close that people get when they're protecting something they think they've already secured. Pamela had her hand on his forearm. Derek was smiling at his phone screen before he even answered it. What came out of that phone was not what either of them expected. I watched his face the way you watch weather change over open water. Fast, total, irreversible. He turned away from Pamela and pressed the phone harder against his ear. She read his posture before she read his expression, and her smile dissolved a full 3 seconds before she understood why. Their attorney's voice, thinned by the speaker but still audible across the marble floor, said the word void twice in the same sentence. Derek found me across the lobby. I held his gaze for exactly as long as it took him to understand that I had been ready for this moment, far longer than he had. Then I walked out into the parking lot, got into my car, and let myself exhale for the first time in 11 months. I should explain how I got there, because the lobby scene only makes sense if you understand what the previous year had cost me. My father built Callaway sheet metal from a single-bay workshop in Decatur, Georgia, into a regional fabrication supplier, with a fleet of 12 trucks and contracts with 4 commercial construction companies. He built it over 31 years, starting with second-hand equipment and a leased space he shared with a transmission shop. By the time I was in high school, the company employed 23 people, and my father knew all of their names and the names of their children. He talked about the business the way some people talk about a piece of land that has been in the family for generations, not as an asset but as a responsibility. When he was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's at 62, the first thing he did after leaving the neurologist's office was call me. I am the younger of 2 children. I am 31 years old. I hold a degree in accounting and a CPA license I have maintained without interruption since I was 24. I have spent the past 6 years working as a forensic accountant for a mid-size firm in Atlanta, which means my professional life consists of reading financial documents that are designed to obscure the truth and locating with some precision exactly where the truth has been buried. It is not glamorous work. Most of the people at my firm's holiday party cannot explain what I do without losing interest in their own explanation halfway through. It also means that when my father called me from the parking lot of a medical building in Buckhead and said he needed someone he could trust to help him think through the future of the business, I was, professionally and personally, the right person to call. My brother Derek is 4 years older than me. He manages the operations side of the company, a title that had evolved over the years from genuine involvement to something more ceremonial. Derek is charming in the way that people who have always been given things tend to be charming. Easily, automatically, without real effort or real warmth underneath it. His wife Pamela has a way of entering a room that suggests she has already assessed its contents and found them adequate. They live in a house in Roswell with a mortgage that has always seemed ambitious relative to Derek's actual salary from Callaway, a discrepancy I noted once and did not pursue. In the months following my father's diagnosis, I began coming to the office on Saturdays. Not because anyone asked me to, but because my father's handwriting on the production schedules had started showing the tremor, and the quarterly filings were running 2 weeks behind. And nobody else seemed to notice or care that the company my father had spent 3 decades building was beginning to slip at the administrative edges. I learned the billing system. I renegotiated 2 supply contracts. I found a $14,000 error in the previous year's payroll tax submission and corrected it before it became an audit issue. Derek came by the office on Saturdays occasionally. He would stand in the doorway of my father's office, where I had set up a secondary workstation, and make observations about how much time I was spending there. Once he said, with the particular lightness that means something heavier, that it was good I didn't have kids yet because otherwise this would be difficult. I smiled and returned to the spreadsheet I was working on. What I did not yet know, and would not know for several more months, was that Derek had been quietly positioning himself. The conversation that changed my understanding of the situation happened on a Sunday in March, approximately 8 months after my father's diagnosis. My father's condition had progressed more quickly than the initial prognosis suggested. Not catastrophically, but with the particular cruelty of a disease that takes things in increments small enough that you keep adjusting to each new baseline before you've fully grieved the one before it. He was spending more time at home. He had begun talking, carefully and seriously, about succession. I was at my parents' house that Sunday helping my mother organize his medication schedule, when Derek arrived with Pamela and a folder he set on the kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the moment. He said he'd been meeting with a business attorney. He said the attorney had reviewed the company's structure and identified what he called a significant liability exposure in the ownership transfer process. He used the phrase estate tax burden several times. He had printed documents, highlighted in yellow, that projected numbers alarming enough to make my mother reach for her reading glasses. The proposal, stripped of its professional language, was this: that I sign over my ownership stake, the 40% my father had already formally transferred to me as part of an estate plan he'd spent 2 years developing with his own attorney, to Derek, who would assume full operational control and manage the company through the transition. In exchange, I would receive a fixed buyout paid over 5 years, an amount Derek's documents described as fair market value. A figure I would later determine had been calculated using a valuation method that was not standard, not current, and not accurate. Derek presented this as the responsible option. He said it would protect my mother. He said it would protect the employees. He said the alternative was a prolonged and expensive probate process that could destabilize the company's contracts and potentially cost people their jobs. He said this while my mother sat at the table, and he said it knowing that my mother spent 31 years watching my father build something for the people who worked there. I said I would think about it. What I did, starting the following morning, was work. I pulled the company's last 3 years of tax returns. I requested the current valuation report Derek's attorney had used and compared the methodology against the 2 other valuation frameworks standard in our industry. The number Derek had offered me as fair market value was based on a suppressed EBITDA calculation that excluded 2 recurring revenue contracts and applied a depreciation schedule that had been accelerated beyond what the assets warranted. The actual value of my 40% stake, calculated correctly, was approximately 2.5 times what Derek's documents suggested. I also, because I am thorough by nature and by training, pulled the company's bank records for the period during which Derek had been managing operations. I found what I had half suspected and half hoped I would not find: a pattern of vendor payments to 2 companies that did not appear in the supplier database, totaling just under $190,000 over a period of 22 months. Both companies were registered in Delaware. One of them shared a registered agent address with a holding LLC that I traced, after 2 evenings and 1 call to a colleague who specializes in corporate structures, to Pamela's maiden name. I sat with that information for 3 days before I decided what to do with it. I want to be precise here, because I think this is the part of the story that is easiest to misread. I was not angry in the way that produces reckless decisions. I was something colder and more focused. The professional version of anger, the kind that makes you careful rather than loud. I had spent 6 years building a career on the premise that documentation, assembled correctly and completely, tells a story that cannot be argued with. I was going to let the documentation tell this one. I called my father's original estate attorney, a woman named Ms. Okafor, who had drafted the ownership transfer documents 2 years earlier, and I made an appointment for the following Thursday. I brought everything: the valuation discrepancy analysis, the vendor payment records, the corporate registry documentation, the chain connecting Pamela's name to the payments. Miss Okafor reviewed my materials for 40 minutes without speaking, which I took as a professional compliment. Then she told me several things that changed the shape of what I thought I was dealing with. The company's original operating agreement, drafted by my father's attorney at the time of formation and updated 3 years ago, contained a clause that Ms. Okafor described as a loyalty provision. Any shareholder found to have engaged in undisclosed self-dealing or financial misrepresentation in connection with an ownership transfer would forfeit their own ownership stake to the remaining shareholders. My father, who had built this company and had watched other family businesses come apart, had included it deliberately. Ms. Okafor said he'd asked for it specifically. She said he told her he'd seen what happened when families let money rewrite the story they told themselves about each other, and he wanted a backstop. That backstop was about to matter. Miss Damn Wanting. Okafor advised me to document the pressure campaign Derek had been running, the calls, the texts, the in-person meetings, the version of events he had presented to my mother. I had kept most of it already because I keep things by habit, but there was a specific meeting coming up, one Derek had scheduled for the following week under the pretense of a final family discussion before I needed to give him a decision, that Ms. Okafor suggested I approach with particular attention. I drove to an electronics store in Midtown on a Wednesday afternoon and purchased a voice recorder small enough to fit in the interior pocket of my jacket. I tested it in my car for 20 minutes before driving home. Then I called Derek and told him I was ready to have the final conversation and that I appreciated everything he was trying to do for the family. He said, of course, that it was no trouble. We met at my parents' house the following Saturday. My mother was there, which Derek had arranged because he understood, correctly, that her presence made me more likely to capitulate. She sat at the dining table with her hands folded, looking tired in the way she had looked tired for months, and I felt the full weight of what Derek was doing, using her exhaustion, her fear, her love for the business my father built as leverage. Derek had a new set of documents. The buyout amount had been revised slightly upward from the original offer, a gesture designed to look like good faith. Pamela sat beside him. Their attorney had sent a cover letter describing the arrangement as straightforward and time-sensitive. I asked, with the careful neutrality I had practiced, what would happen to the company's existing contracts if I chose instead to retain my stake and bring in an independent third-party valuator. Derek's answer was immediate and specific. He said the company's main contractor relationship would not survive a prolonged ownership dispute. He named the contractor. He described the consequences for the employees in terms that were designed to land on my mother. Then he said, and I want to be precise, because this is the part I will not omit the way the version of me who was tired and overwhelmed might have omitted it. He said that if I chose not to cooperate, he had documentation that could raise questions about the accuracy of the payroll corrections I had made to the company's filings the previous year. There was no such documentation. The corrections I had made were accurate and had been confirmed by a CPA. He was describing evidence that did not exist. Pamela added that the whole situation would be so much cleaner if I could just trust my own family. My mother looked at the table. I picked up the pen. I signed the transfer documents on every page and handed them back to Derek's attorney, who was present by phone. Derek leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of someone who has just stopped carrying a weight. Pamela touched his hand. My mother exhaled. What none of them knew was that 40 minutes earlier, while I was in the bathroom before the meeting started, I had uploaded a complete documentation package, the valuation discrepancy analysis, the vendor payment records, the corporate registry chain, and a time-stamped audio file of the meeting I'd had with Ms. Okafor the previous week outlining the full scope of what I had found, to a secure filing portal. Ms. Okafor had submitted a formal complaint on my behalf to the state's business court that morning. The recorder in my jacket had captured everything said in that dining room. The transfer documents I signed were already flagged for review. Derek's attorney called him 9 minutes after I left the house. I know, because I was sitting in my car at the end of my parents' street, and I watched Derek come out of the front door still holding his phone, his face doing the thing that faces do when a certainty dissolves faster than the mind can track it. I drove home. I made a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without doing anything in particular. The business court's ruling came down 7 weeks later. The transfer documents were invalidated on the grounds of documented coercion and material misrepresentation in connection with an ownership transfer. The operating agreement's loyalty provision was triggered. Derek's ownership stake, the 60% that had been our father's and that my father had transferred to him in good faith, was subject to forced redemption under the terms Ms. Okafor had cited. The vendor payment irregularities were referred to a separate proceeding. Derek and Pamela's attorney received a formal inquiry from the state bar. My father was told about the outcome by Ms. Okafor in a phone call I was present for. He was quiet for a long time afterward. Then he said he was sorry I had needed to do what I did alone. I told him the documentation had done most of the work. That made him laugh a little, which was worth more to me than most of what came after. I am still managing the transition. I brought in an outside operations consultant to cover the gap Derek's departure left. 2 of the company's longtime employees have stepped into expanded roles and are doing well. The main contractor relationship, which Derek had described as fragile, turned out to be entirely stable. The project manager I spoke with had no idea there had ever been a dispute. I did not block Derek's number immediately. I waited until he sent a text that described what he had done as a misunderstanding and what I had done as a betrayal, at which point I blocked it. I had one conversation with my mother that I will not reconstruct in detail because it is not mine alone to tell. What I will say is that she knew more than I had assumed and had been carrying that knowledge in the particular way that mothers carry things they are not sure they have the right to act on. We are working through it in the way that people work through things when the damage and the love are inseparable from each other. What I keep returning to is something Ms. Okafor said to me at the end of our first meeting when I had spread all the documents across her conference table and explained what I had found and what I thought it meant. She looked at the pile and then she looked at me and she said, very simply, "Your father built something worth protecting, and you were the one paying attention." I think about that a lot. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of quiet recognition. I was 11 years old, Pervilly, watching them move through to father, useful to the people who worked there, and that usefulness had been in the process of being reframed, slowly and deliberately, as naivety. The assumption was that someone who cared about the right things could be counted on not to look too hard at the wrong ones. They miscalculated. There is a version of this story where I am too tired or too trusting or too conscious of my mother's face across the table to buy the recorder, to pull the bank records, to sit with Ms. Okafor for 40 minutes and let the numbers say what they say. I am aware of that version. I keep it visible the way you keep a near miss visible. Not to congratulate yourself on the outcome, but to remember exactly how close the other ending was. I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a real question. Not a way to close out a story neatly. How many people in your life have assumed that because you are the one who shows up, you are also the one who won't notice? That the same quality that makes you reliable makes you easy to mislead? And at what point does keeping the peace stop being generosity and start being a cost you are paying entirely by yourself? I don't have a clean answer. I have a 40% stake in a fabrication company in Decatur, a recorder I still keep in my jacket pocket out of habit, and a father who calls me on Sunday mornings to ask how the week went. That is enough for now.